Next, a little girl goes missing.
Kids just don't disappear.
Her name's Cynthia, and she's 9 years old.
Searchers spend weeks looking for her.
They did a search basically on their hands and knees, looking for evidence.
But a psychic told them where to go.
I don't know any other way to explain it, but she described it as having a vision, some sort of religious experience where she saw something in her mind.
Some dead plants give investigators a vital clue, but will it be enough to find the killer?
It's difficult to conceive of an individual who would do that to a 9-year-old girl.
It was a normal 4th of July as residents of Lakewood, Washington celebrated with the usual parade and picnics. For Rhonda Hebison, it was time to spend with her 3 daughters, Brittany, Ashley, and Cindy.
Cindy basically was in and out of the house all day playing, and I was doing chores around the house. And thought maybe later on that day we would go down by the waterfront and watch the fireworks.
But 9-year-old Cindy didn't come home at dinner time as she usually did.
So I started walking around the neighborhood asking people if they had seen her, and they hadn't seen her.
As night fell, hundreds of people gathered for the fireworks display. That's when Cindy's mother called the sheriff's department.
Yes, my daughter is missing. She hasn't came home yet. Where was she going when you last saw her? She was going over to a friend's house, and she's not there.
Sheriff's deputies searched the neighborhood and found no trace of her.
By morning, it had become quite serious. She still had not returned, and there had been no phone calls by her or anyone else.
Over 100 volunteers helped in the search.
You've got brushy areas, and in this part of the country, you have these blackberry bushes with these just nasty thorns on them. So these searchers, they were going through these weeds and these bramble bushes, and they were coming out just scratched and bleeding.
I'm just really amazed how many people have been coming together and helping me out and praying for Cindy.
48 hours passed, and police focused their attention on Cindy's parents, who were divorced. Cindy's father had an alibi for the afternoon of her disappearance. But during the call to report Cindy missing, investigators thought her mother sounded vague.
Color shirt or jacket that she was wearing. I can't remember. She was wearing a dress.
She didn't seem to show a lot of emotion about her daughter being missing. She didn't seem concerned or very worried.
Police interrogated Rhonda for hours.
They brought her in there one night about 9 p.m., and they kept her there until 6 in the morning the next day.
That was really horrible. That was, it was a nightmare. I thought I was going to go to jail.
Rhonda denied involvement in her daughter's disappearance, but she failed a polygraph test.
During the mother's polygraph, she was asked questions about whether she had any knowledge of Cindy's whereabouts. And that was the question that she failed. She had said she did not.
I hadn't been sleeping, I hadn't been eating. I was a mess.
Neighbors' prayers for the child's safe return went unanswered. Even the promise of a $5,000 reward didn't produce results.
You guys heard about the missing little girl? Her name's Cynthia, and she's 9 years old.
2 weeks passed. Then, police received a call from a member of Rhonda's church. She said she saw something in a dream.
She described it as having a vision. some sort of religious experience where she saw something in her mind.
The woman said she had a vision of a young girl lying in a field who was either asleep or dead. She even drew a map of where the body was. The spot was a half-mile from Cindy's home, an area volunteers had already searched.
They did a search basically on their hands and knees looking for evidence, and they didn't find her the first time.
But this time, they found Cindy Allinger's body. She was under a water heater and wrapped in some carpet.
It'll never be the way it was. All the kids. It won't. You see them walking in tubes now still. And I think it'll stay that way because the kids now know that it could happen to anybody.
Police now faced an unusual situation. A mother who failed a polygraph test and a psychic who mysteriously knew the location of Cindy's body.
I thought this was so bizarre that they would have found the body this way.
9-year-old Cindy Allinger was buried amid a community stunned by the brutality of her death. Her autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and beaten.
I think it was just shocking and scary to imagine what's out there.
Cindy's body was found next to an abandoned house in a large field. The body was wrapped in 4 layers of thick shag carpet.
This neighborhood was known to be the highest gang area in our city. There were approximately 64 sex offenders registered in that area, so the area was pretty well saturated with sex offenders.
Before police could interview them, they needed to know when Cindy was murdered. For that, they looked at insect activity on her body.
After death, insects will in fact find the body and then begin to exploit the body as a source of food.
But in this case, Dr. Goff needed to know if the carpet that covered Cindy's body hindered the insect activity. So Dr. Goff wrapped a dead animal in several layers of carpet and placed it outside. Then he monitored the insect activity.
You work backwards, and then you determine approximately when the egg was laid. And this is going to be an estimate of the minimum period of time since death.
The test showed that the carpet prevented insects from getting to the body for a full day. This proved that Cindy was murdered on or about the day she went missing, July 4th. Police interviewed all 64 sex offenders in the area to ascertain their whereabouts for the 4th of July. All had alibis.
I didn't know that there was that many sex offenders in that area. When I heard about that, I was like, I'm moving.
It was Cindy's sister, Ashley, who was 7 years old at the time, who provided an important clue.
I do remember we were playing together, and then she told me she was going down to Raz's house. I know she liked going down there a lot. Raz was a guy that lived down the street from us, an older man.
Raz was Guy Rasmussen, a 30-year-old musician.
I actually went over there with her a few times. She just played with his dog and he had a drum set in his shed, and she'd go in there with him and play the drums.
Guy Rasmussen stood out in the neighborhood because he looked like a hippie with his tie-dye shirts, and he seemed out of his time zone.
Cindy's mother originally thought Raz was the same age as her children. When she learned he was an adult, she put her foot down.
I thought it was a kid, And then she said it was a man. And I said, well, you can't go over to this man's house. I don't know him, and you're not supposed to play with grown men.
When police questioned Rasmussen, he denied Cindy had been to his home on July 4th. He also claimed to have an alibi.
Guy Rasmussen told us that he was picked up from the store by his friend at approximately 4:15 that afternoon, and then they went to the Rock Festival in Thurston County.
Payphone records confirmed this 4:15 call. Cindy's mother said she last saw Cindy at 4:30.
If she had last seen her at 4:30, then Guy Rasmussen would have had an airtight alibi.
But like Cindy's mother, Rasmussen also failed a polygraph test.
It is probably the most frustrating case of anyone's career.
But in Rasmussen's trash, police found a torn drawing of Rasmussen's dog that Cindy had given to him several weeks earlier.
It was interesting that he had torn up this picture, and this was after he knew that she was missing.
But did this mean anything? Cindy Allinger's mother, Rhonda, and a neighbor, Guy Rasmussen, both failed polygraph examinations when questioned about Cindy's murder. But then a new suspect emerged, Rhonda's boyfriend, Chris Doyle.
He had a history of domestic violence. He had hit Rhonda. It was not clear whether or not he had, physically assaulted the kids, but he did have a temper.
During police interrogation, Doyle admitted he once threw Cindy off of the porch during an argument, but denied any involvement in Cindy's murder.
When he was questioned, there were things that he didn't want me to know about, that he admitted to hurting Cindy. I didn't know about that. I thought it was an accident the whole time.
The mother's boyfriend was given a polygraph exam as well, and he did pass that polygraph exam.
Police also questioned the psychic who had led police to Cindy's body.
She would never go on the record in terms of, agreeing to an interview. We spoke on the phone.
But the psychic had an alibi and was eliminated as a suspect. So police turned their attention back to Guy Rasmussen. A background check revealed Rasmussen served 6 years in prison for raping a teenager and assaulting a 10-year-old girl. He had also been a suspect in 2 previous murders, although wasn't charged because of a lack of evidence.
He had been polygraphed in both those homicides and had failed.
In Cindy's case, Rasmussen claimed to have an alibi for the time of her murder.
He had called his friend at approximately 4:15 on the payphone to come pick him up.
And telephone records confirmed it. Cindy's mother told police she last saw her daughter at 4:30 on the afternoon of July 4th. But investigators replayed the 911 call Cindy's mother made to police and discovered a discrepancy.
How long ago was it that you'd last seen her? I saw her last about 3 o'clock.
We were able to determine that basically Rhonda's sense of what happened that day was simply not accurate.
Cindy's mother said it was a simple mistake. This information provided a window from about 3 o'clock to 4:15 when Rasmussen could have committed the crime. Armed with this new information, Investigators searched Rasmussen's home and confiscated the clothes he was wearing on July 4th, the clothes his friend said Rasmussen was wearing at the concert.
Guy Rasmussen had been keeping his unwashed clothing in the bathtub in the home, and so it was just all strewn in there.
Of particular interest were tiny bits of plant material on his shoes and socks. So police sent the samples to forensic botanist Dr. Laree Dennis Johnston. Her first task was to identify the different plants on Rasmussen's clothes to see whether they were the same as those at the crime scene.
The samples were mostly seeds, very small. I checked them out with my hand lens, ended up putting them under a microscope. There were a couple of species of brome grass, Hocus lanatus, which is velvet grass.
More than a dozen plant species were identified on Rasmussen's clothes. They weren't only the same species as those found at the crime scene. They were also at the exact same stage of development. This led to only one conclusion.
If he said he wasn't there and the plants are showing that he was, then they can say he was there.
But Rasmussen continued to maintain his innocence during a radio interview. He told the audience he met Cindy only once.
The girl liked animals. I didn't know her, really, and I didn't know her parents or anything. When she come over, me and my girlfriend at the time said, "You need to go home and tell your mom where you're at."
What Rasmussen said was one thing, but something scientists found on his shirt was quite another. The chief suspect in Cindy Allinger's murder was Guy Rasmussen, who had a history of sexual violence. His credibility was shattered when police learned he had lied about his relationship with Cindy.
Guy Rasmussen told investigators, and he told me, that he'd only met Cindy once. But later it came out that he'd actually met her a few times.
We learned from the younger sister, Ashley, that Guy Rasmussen had given them a stuffed animal, a rabbit with a carrot. Is what he gave her.
But the only evidence linking him to the crime was some plant material on his clothing. But then investigators found something else, a stain on Rasmussen's shirt.
When we initially collected the items from Guy Rasmussen's home, we didn't realize right away what we had. The clothing was dirty, unwashed, and the shirts were multicolored, so it was hard to see what was on it.
A preliminary test confirmed the stain was human blood. A DNA test found not one, but two genetic profiles.
They confirmed that the stain on his shorts was the blood from Cindy Allinger and the seaman Guy Rasmussen, and they were a mixed stain. It was DNA positive that he had committed this crime.
Well, I can't describe how disgusted I am when I think about him.
Rasmussen was arrested while on stage playing a concert at a local club. He wasn't on the county sex offender list because his last conviction came before the law went into effect.
charging the defendant with aggravated murder, first-degree kidnapping, and first-degree child rape.
Guy Rasmussen is a monster. It's difficult to conceive of an individual who would do that to a 9-year-old girl.
The man who appeared in court was a far cry from the long-haired musician of just a few days earlier. But prosecutors painted a different picture of Rasmussen for the jury. They said that on July 4th, Cindy went to Rasmussen's home as she often did.
Hey, Cindy. Yeah, I'm gonna go buy a new place soon. You wanna come check it out with me?
But this time, Rasmussen somehow lured her to an abandoned house several blocks away, possibly telling her he was thinking about buying it to fix it up. Once there, he raped and murdered the little girl. Then he wrapped her body with a carpet from the house. He left her in the field, picking up the plant material on his shoes and socks. Then he walked to a nearby payphone and called a friend in order to create an alibi. The insect activity established an estimated time of death, and the plant material on his shoes and socks proved he was in the field. But his clothes stained with Cindy's blood left no doubt. He was the killer.
We needed science to guide us. We needed things like the botanist and the entomology studies and the DNA especially to get us in the right direction.
During his trial, Rasmussen's lawyers claimed the forensic entomology report was incorrect and that Rasmussen was innocent because the crime occurred during the time he had an alibi. That argument failed to impress the jury.
We, the jury, having found the defendant guilty of premeditated murder.
Rasmussen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
I'd like to see him get executed. He don't deserve to live. He killed my daughter. She was only 9 years old. She didn't have very much of a life.
It was important to show the jury how painstakingly the police built the case, that it wasn't a rush to judgment, anything of the sort, that it was done very professionally and deliberately.
It's kind of like losing everything you got. Like somebody just takes everything away from you, like including your inside. It's just like your heart's been ripped out.
If I could talk to her, I'd just tell her I love her very, very much. And that she was a real sweet, loving little girl.
Many believe Rasmussen would have continued on his crime spree. But a combination of evidence, bugs, plants, and DNA ensured he would never again prey on little girls.
If they didn't have forensic science, it would be kind of hard to pinpoint the killers. It's amazing what they're able to do these days with just the tiniest little things. Piece of grass.
You have to remain scientifically objective and neutral. You can't adopt let's get the bad guys mentality. You can't take sides. In all instances, you have to remain impartial.
About the only thing science couldn't explain was how the psychic knew the location of her body.
The searchers didn't find her but for the tip from the psychic, it may well have been a long time before she was found.